Just a few reminders on etiquette. We ask that you turn your phone off, your computer speakers off to avoid feedback, and mute your line unless you're speaking to the group. During the lecture, you can have your camera off, and then at the end of the lecture, if you want to turn it on for discussion, that's totally fine. So today, Anna Marie and I will be your instructors. So we've been around for a couple of these lectures now, but just a reminder, we have this great group of folks who have been here along our journey, and thanks to all of them. And you'll be seeing some of them this week in our discussion session. So don't forget that we have that coming up as well. So today's agenda, we are in session 6. This is a lecture where we're going to be wrapping up the course. We're going to be talking about communicating about climate change and telling your adaptation story, and then we'll go through the homework for next time. First off, I'd like to just say congratulations to all of you, because you have now made it through all of the steps of the workbook. So you did it, congratulations. So give yourselves a big pat on the back. And if you haven't finished yet, that's okay. We still have another week before your presentations. So, but for those of you who have done it, I bet it really feels great. I know I always feel good when I finish something. When we started out the course, there are some major questions that we had. We went through all these 5 steps to ask, how might climate change affect the resources we manage, and what management actions could help us prepare for those resources? And if you were like most people, you were maybe a little bit unsure of what that was all about. Maybe you were like that kitty cat hiding in the box. I actually heard there's a study where they put like these borders for a box, but no actual box, and the cats would go and sit in the borders. So it's not just the box, physical box, but it is the defined space that they want to fill. So we tried that with our cats and it failed miserably, but maybe you can try it at home and it'll work for you. So now we are like this kitten here. We've got it. We've been through the process. We understand how our resources might be affected by climate change, and we understand how our actions could help us prepare for those effects. So hopefully you're feeling good about it. And we have been monitoring your progress through the homework. So this homework was not completely for naught. We actually got some information out of it. And so what it's telling us is that your progress has improved in both being able to identify viable climate change adaptation strategies that can be applied to your local area. So you're feeling more comfortable with that. And also that you can translate broad adaptation strategies to actionable adaptation tactics for your local area. So great. That means that our course is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So now that you're all done, you can go through and download your adaptation plan and share it with all your friends and your mom or your grandma or your kids, because somebody is collecting those, I saw in the chat, and I'm sure they'll all be very proud of you. And if you don't have a mom or grandma or kids, you can show it to your dog. Your dog would also be very proud of you, or your colleagues. Anyway, please go ahead and download your adaptation plan. You can add information to it if you would like, and an appendix. Some of you went through and did an extra little workbook for some of the adaptation strategies and approaches that weren't in the workbook yet, so that's an opportunity as well. And if you have any questions about how to download that or what to do with it, please let us know. So the purpose of this course was to help you learn how to adapt using the adaptation workbook process. So you're invested. You can use this process again. You can use your expertise and judgment to think about your place and objectives within the context of your risks and values. And you can document your intent, write it down. Management can play out on the order of decades. So that's why we're asking you to write it down, and that's what we're doing with this whole process. It also helps you learn as a community of practice. So you've developed this community over the course of this 7-week course. And so all the folks that are in this class can be part of that community of practice with you, as well as your broader set of colleagues that you're sharing your information with. So a few things to wrap up. Finish up your work in the adaptation workbook if you haven't done so already. Share your story, share your finished product with your colleagues and friends, and we're going to talk about how we will share our story in just a few moments. And don't forget that we will have a discussion session this week on monitoring and communication. So the details on that will be at the end of today's session. So climate change communication. I'm going to start off this lecture and then hand it over to Anna Marie to talk about reaching and connecting with your audience. So it's one thing to communicate the hows and whys of your new plan, and bringing climate change into the mix adds another layer to navigate when communicating effectively. So the basic recipe here for climate change communication, and the big key points that I hope you're going to take away from today. We're going to dive deeper into these concepts and highlight key considerations for creating meaningful messages and having effective interactions with your audience. So these are to listen to people. Sorry, I'm just trying to move things around here so I can listen to people and their needs. Make it relevant. So making sure that the things that you're communicating are actually relevant to the audience and their needs that you're addressing. Find solutions and stay action-oriented. Instead of just talking about doom and gloom or problems, we want to be solutions-focused. And then we want to be creative and flexible in our delivery. So professionals are increasingly expected to integrate climate change into their plans, documents, and activities. And perhaps that's why you've decided to join this course. But there's a need to understand and effectively communicate that information to diverse audiences. And you might be talking to different groups of people that have different sets of values. And so all of those folks might need a slightly different way of communicating. So the first thing is to know your audience. And there are a lot of great resources out there to help you understand your audience. One great resource is from the Yale Center for Climate Communication. And this program has been doing national surveys to understand the population's feelings about, is climate change happening, and how do they feel about it? They've also put people into these broad categories, which they call the 6 Americas. And these are the alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. So the alarmed and concerned folks are the people who are most concerned about climate change, and those in the doubtful and dismissive are the don't have a belief that climate change is happening, or they're not concerned about it. And what you can see is that the biggest groups right now are in that alarmed and concerned category, and that has been growing over time. across the entire country, about 67% of adults think that global warming is happening as of 2019, and that number is growing. And all these areas in like yellow, orange, red, these are counties where the majority of adults agree that global warming is happening. And you can see most of the country is in that yellow, orange, or red category. On a national level, like I said before, 67% of global warming of adults believe that global warming is happening. And the majority also believe that global warming is caused mostly by human activities. Where there is maybe a little bit less agreement on is whether they think most scientists think global warming is happening. And they also think that global warming is affecting the weather. So fewer people disagree with those statements than agree. Nationally, people are worried about it. They are worried that it's going to be harming plants and animals, that it'll harm future generations, that will harm people in the United States as well as in developing countries. But fewer people are concerned that global warming is going to affect them personally. So there is a little bit of a disconnect here. So if you look at the percent of adults that think global warming will harm plants and animals, it's 69%. And you can see just about everywhere in the country, people think that this is going to harm plants and animals. But fewer people think that scientists think that global warming is happening. So this is a communication problem for scientists. Even though 97% of climate scientists agree that global warming is happening, the general public is not getting that message. And a lot of that is coming from the popular press, which always is showing this like two sides to every story, when it's not really what's happening in the scientific community. But where you'll see universities, like you can see where University of Wisconsin is, and University of Michigan, and University of Texas, those areas are more in that orange color. And so folks that are around more scientists understand that scientists generally agree that climate change is happening. We can also examine this information locally. So you can look and zoom into a particular county of interest where you're working. So you can just zoom in on Houghton County, for example, where Houghton, Michigan is, and most of the NIAX folks are located. And what that is telling us is that most folks believe that global warming is going to affect developing countries and people in the United States, but only 39% think that it's going to affect them personally. So that's where I feel like there's a little bit more of a disconnect. And so we need to make more of that personal connection. If we look more specifically at people in the natural resource sector, we can see that forest landowners generally agree that climate change is happening, humans are contributing to it, and that forest management can affect climate change. And these numbers are even higher than the general public, and this is for the state of Michigan. So when we're focusing in on natural resource managers who are really seeing and experiencing these effects firsthand, there's even a greater consensus that this is happening. We can also look at similar data sets for Canada. And again, 80% believe that climate change is having a significant effect on forest ecosystems, and then 89% believe that it will have within 50 years and 93% within 100 years. And that they also are suggesting that we're not at a state where forest practices currently implemented are sufficient to face climate change impacts on forests. And so this is showing us again that this is a general concern for people in natural resource management. This is another study looking at the state of Hawaii across different ethnic groups and religious beliefs. And what this is showing is that there is a perceived frequency of these increases in climate-related events happening across the state of Hawaii. And there's also differences in perceptions on preparedness ratings. And what this is also showing, this study is not also showing, and this isn't shown in the graphs, is Indigenous Hawaiians felt overall that these events were a greater risk and that there was less preparedness. And so it's also important to keep in mind that different populations can have different perceptions of risks and preparedness, and that can be related to their lived experiences. So how do we overcome the psychological distance of climate change and make it relevant to people on the ground? So one thing is that people often think of climate change as a distant or far off risk for many people. So it's not happening where I live, and it's not happening now. It's a future problem, and it's a far away problem. If you're living in the Midwest, for example, sea level rise is just not maybe a concern for you. So if you're hearing about that as a big risk, that's not something you're concerned about. So how do you make that relevant? Well, here in the Midwest, where I'm from, we can talk about things like extreme precipitation events causing dramatic damage to roads and infrastructure, and flash flooding. We also need to keep in mind that natural resource managers have a lot of different things on their mind. So in addition to keeping things locally relevant, we also need to keep in mind that climate change is just one piece of a big puzzle. So as much as we can relate it to all those different pieces, that can help it resonate and make it more important for natural resource managers. Climate change also amplifies a lot of inequities. So when we're thinking about climate change risks, not every area is going to be affected by climate change in the same way. For example, in urban areas, people in low-income communities often have less tree canopy cover than areas that are higher income. So they are more at risk to increases in temperature. Indigenous areas also, indigenous populations also have inequities associated with climate change. So for example, if you're on a reservation or you have treaty rights in a particular area, you cannot just move to a new area as the climate changes and moves habitat suitability for the species that you care about. So those types of inequities are important to keep in mind as you're moving forward and talking about those climate change related risks. It's also important to avoid fear, blame, and shame. We know that climate is changing and we need to talk about it, and this can become an overwhelming issue to people. If we always just talk about all the things that we've done wrong, people can shut down and get defensive. As a communicator, we need to shift out of that kind of doom and gloom and blame and shame towards outcomes and actions. People need to feel empowered that they can do something. So demonstrating what you can do through adaptation actions is a really great start to that. So there are a lot of resources and research out there, and it's important for us to be aware that our audiences perceive, believe, and value, so we can be tailoring our message about climate change to them. So aligning your message with these factors will make your conversation more impactful. It's one thing to know your audience, but a whole other to connect with them. So listening is a big part of that process. Creating opportunities to truly take in, understand, and absorb who they are is going to be critical for reflecting them in your work and harboring support for your efforts. Focusing on shared values can be an important part of your work, and there's a lot to be learned from our communities who have different ways of knowing as well. So how do we connect and engage with these audiences? We can do this by identifying something your community cares about and connecting with those values. And why does your audience care about that place? Is it for the cross-country skiing or mountain biking, opportunities for foraging, bird watching, fishing, hunting, traditional cultural uses? All of those things could be a value in which you can connect your audience to understanding how climate change is impacting. So collectively, climate change threatens your local and plant and animal beings and species, and tribal sovereignty and the economy and culture. So telling a story that links values is going to help connecting with future generations. A big part of communicating climate change is just showing up and listening. So listening to people's experiences and expertise and being honest and open and direct and humble. Invest your time and consider their places and realities. You want to tailor your message for your audience. Ask, who am I talking to? Who will be there and what do they want to know? Research their local issues, recent disturbances or climate trends that might be on people's minds. So do your audience homework and don't assume anything. But if you're talking to an audience where you're pretty sure that they're going to have a certain value. For example, if you're talking to a group of anglers, you can talk about the effect on fish populations and opportunities for fishing. That's likely going to resonate with the audience more than talking about polar bears and penguins, which is a no-brainer, but it does take a little bit of extra time to research your audience and understand what matters to them. So I think now I'm going to hand it over to Anna Marie, and she's going to be talking about how to discuss climate narratives.
All right, can everyone see that clearly? Does it look good? Okay. All right, great. So to develop messages for your audience, we need to develop new climate narratives. And the place to start is with unbiased scientific research. There are many misconceptions about climate change, and it's a really, really complex issue. A better understanding comes when you can sort the myths from the facts. So for general audiences, try to minimize delving deep into scientific research and use model results as a part of a larger story so you can use facts to really ground your storytelling. It's also important to highlight resources that are easily accessible to the general public and be clear about uncertainty in model results, meaning ensure your audience sees the full range of risk rather than only focusing on the worst case scenario. And a good resource example is the 4th National Climate Assessment, which was released in 2 volumes and linked here. And these provide the best available science and research in a relevant, accessible format and also provide key messages and supporting evidence. So let's dig a little more into our messaging. When developing climate narratives, we need to present the data's uncertainty in our statements. There is uncertainty in everything. We don't know the future. We don't have a crystal ball, but we live in an uncertain world every day. You know, we follow weather models, we drive, and we interpret and understand these risks. So focus our certainty in terms of when instead of if, and again, be sure to show that full range of risk projections. We can admit that we don't know exactly how severe it's going to get, but we generally have a really good idea of the full range. Avoid using a fixed point in time. So for example, saying a really specific year like 2072, and instead show a range of the years based on model projections. Also avoid using will statements and instead use language such as expected to, may, or as projected to. And lastly, really find opportunities to draw on trends that people see and observe now to describe the extension of this trend into the future. Support your messaging with facts and statistics, but be sure to break this down and make the research relevant. Share real science and acknowledge what we know through observed trends, data sets, and experiences, as well as what we don't know. And finally, why do we care? What does this all mean? Be sure to pull it together into a pitch that resonates locally and connect the dots. So for instance, you may have data that shows February average temperatures are increasing by almost half a degree each decade. But what does that really mean? What does a half a degree difference make? You can frame this in terms of a warmer winter, earlier spring, and shifting plant hardiness zones. So shorter winters and earlier green-up may result in better growing conditions for native species. And with a shift in plant hardiness zones, we may be able to plant species that we usually can't get to grow here. But with longer growing seasons, that may also bring about drought and increased opportunities for invasive species and pests. So making climate change relevant to your audience means that we need to connect climate change to the issues that matter most. And this circles back to our values discussion. Talking about changes in your audience's place will really help close that distance and help them move from a distant concern to local action. So to visualize change, tell a local story. This will help move from broad regional climate changes to local level impacts. So you can think a little bit about what visual stories you can tell in the area that you're working in. Has your audience experienced major climate impacts before? Has there been a major flood or drought? And what does this look like on the ground? So it can be useful to use these local impacts from well-known disasters and then focus on coming together as a community and how we overcame those challenges in the past. What can we do to ensure these impacts are less severe the next time around? Researching local experiences and stories can help our audience visualize climate projections locally and in a context that feels closer to home. And using these stories and imagery can really help us make connections much quicker. When we introduce specific local impacts and changes for our audience's place, we want to be specific. Climate change can be very vague, and the messaging can be lost when we don't provide specific impacts. And connecting local issues to local action is more effective when you can bring about that specificity to the topic. So for example, instead of just saying we will see an increase in precipitation in the future, we can say that within the next 20 years, we will see a 10 to 20% increase in 3-inch rain events, which could result in up to X% of soil loss. Or you could point to a major flooding event that happened in the past and say that it'll be even more extreme than that one. So help your audience identify ways that climate change may change our forests, our watersheds, and put certain communities at risk. It can be really complicated to talk about climate change, and there's a fine line between data and doom and gloom. So in our communication, we can definitely recognize the losses, the threats, and the challenges. This is the reality of it all, but we need to check ourselves to ensure we are shifting from data and threats to positive and productive messages. So if we emphasize the terrible, fatalistic aspects of climate change, it's going to make people feel helpless and disengaged. We want to make people feel like they can really do something about climate change, such as planting future adapted species and reforestation efforts. And we want to shift the mentality away from the idea that we can't do anything to the idea that we can do something. So share an opportunity that might be present and ideas and solutions that can empower the audience and empower change. So let's shift a little bit into finding ways to make our messages more tangible. So we are connecting with our audience, we're learning about their values, we're making it specific and about local conditions and impacts, but we don't want to get bogged down in politics. It's easy to say that climate change is all about science and not a political issue, but it is often made into one in reality. So instead, try to find ways to focus on themes that can engage across the political spectrum, regardless of your political affiliation. So talk about themes that we all care about and can bridge the divide, particularly values and themes that resonate widely with everyone, such as jobs, aesthetic beauty, tradition, and sense of place. And if we don't want to make climate change a political issue, we don't want to rely on just politicians or the media to communicate about climate change. We want to use trusted messengers who use simple, clear messages repeated often by a variety of trusted voices. And those messengers can be us, but we can also engage with health professionals, outdoor recreation organizations, faith networks, and trusted peers in our communities we work in, depending on who our audience is. You can also partner with local organizations to help tap into that broader audience. So something like tribes, land trusts, watershed groups, local game chapters, professional organizations, or soil and water conservation districts. While individual values are important, we also want to focus on self-transcending values. So people recognize their importance in the big picture. So self-transcendence means considering oneself an integral part of the universe and thinking beyond their individual person. So thinking about what we can do now to make sure our children have a better future. Thinking about the bottom line of making more money is thinking more about yourself and your needs, but thinking about the health of the forest is self-transcending and takes into a consideration a wider worldview about the future of the forest and what that forest will look like for future generations. So in our communication, this can look like prioritizing healthier ecosystems that are more resilient to future changes, as opposed to making the messaging about immediate achievements or gratification that keep the focus to the near term. And that's not to say that, harvesting timber is bad. Livelihoods are really important, but simply think more expansively about your short and long-term goals to really prioritize forest health and the well-being of future ecosystems and generations. So it's important to show clear, plausible, and meaningful actions that people can take in response to climate risks. This is also an opportunity to highlight win-win options so people can take to respond to climate change. Emphasize actions that can reduce threats and use other people's stories to show the power of intentional, careful planning. Use real-world stories to articulate tactical details that demonstrate how others are taking actions to overcome challenges. And again, we really want to elicit that I can do it mentality. So when we are being specific about our local impacts, we can list them as multiple reasons for why we might implement an action in response to climate change. This helps us stay solutions focused and emphasizes how our actions may be a win-win that has multiple benefits. So for example, maybe we want to increase diversity in our forests and to reduce the risk of impacts like pest diseases and warmer temperatures. This example really calls out the risks and benefits to forests. Or maybe thinking about the local impacts of past disasters can inspire support to redesign infrastructure and facilities that can better cope with more severe future conditions. This example highlights the costs, cleanup, and safety aspects. And this type of thinking demonstrates not only the benefits of one action, but the win-win opportunities we have at our disposal that may help reduce the severity and risk of stressors and climate impacts over time. So climate change it's really hard to visualize. It's a huge, intangible, abstract global problem, but try to just say no to graphic images like polar bears that typically aren't relevant to most people. It's an audience turnoff and immediately increases that psychological distance between the issue and your audience. And it's not to say we can't highlight these stories. I mean, some species are severely impacted by climate change than others. Polar bears are bearing witness to extreme shifts in their environment, but unfortunately, most folks can't imagine a polar bear in their own backyard and the circumstances they're facing. So this imagery reduces the problem to a far off distant land and not a problem that's happening at home. So try to opt for images that people will recognize in their lives. Temperatures are increasing where you live, so how does that impact local resources, species, and geography? So to summarize so far, here are some of the do's and don'ts when it comes to climate change communication. So tailor your information to your specific audience, understand their values and make it local, keep stats to a minimum, present ranges when it comes to data and projections, and avoid complex graphs, maintain proximity and use examples, talk about opportunities and actions, and don't present generic, technical, scientific language for a mainstream audience. Avoid excessive stats, data, graphs, as well as irrelevant imagery. Don't be abstract about threats. Avoid couching impacts as only a far-off worry into the future, and don't focus on that doom and gloom. All right, so now we're going to shift a little bit away from more general communication to think a little bit about crafting meaningful climate-informed messages. So pulling all of these components together into a message, there's really no perfect model to use, but here's an example storyline to follow. Start with describing your place and purpose, highlight key risks from climate change, describe adaptation actions that could be taken to address risks, and end with outcomes and benefits of those actions. So one example is from northern Minnesota along the Superior Hiking Trail. Planners here have evaluated climate change impacts and see that impacts may exacerbate other problems related to erosion and more visitation overall, especially on weekends. And evaluating the impact of longer, wetter seasons, they're planning to take steps that will protect visitor safety. So this statement is a great succinct example of a message that includes all of the necessary components of a climate change story. Explaining their place, their values, and the situation they're facing, and then also showcasing how they are planning to face that problem head on. So here it's longer hiking seasons plus wetter conditions equals more soft closures to reduce hazards. You can also practice telling your brief climate change story using our NIAC's climate adaptation Mad Lib, and this might be a little cheesy, but it really does help, even if it's just a starting point, to get all of those necessary climate communication components into a short, straightforward statement. And the previous slides provided some shorter examples of climate communication, but of course there are longer stories to tell. So if you can, it's critical to use examples to show clear, tangible actions people can take to respond to climate risks. And we found these real-world stories can quickly help our audiences conceptualize what climate change vulnerability and climate adaptation actions look like in a variety of circumstances, landform types, and ownerships. And we have collected these stories on our website to demonstrate the huge variety of perspectives and intentional climate-informed actions being taken across the Midwest and the Northeast. And you can feel free to check some of these out by visiting forestadaptation.org/demos. So there's a lot to uncover here, and I'm not an expert in climate change communication. Don't let today be your first or last opportunity to think about climate communication and messaging. Continue to seek out additional resources such as the IPCC Principles for Public Engagement, which is written for scientists, but it's broadly applicable. Another helpful resource is the climateoutreach.org's Talking Climate Handbook about how to have conversations about climate change in your daily life. You can also connect with adaptation professionals. These principles of adaptation communication are supported by the American Society of Adaptation Professionals Living Guide to the Principles of Climate Change Adaptation, which outlines fundamental principles for engaging in professional activities in the field of climate communication and adaptation. And these principles also underpin everything we do at NIACS and underpin all of ASAP's education and training activities for adaptation professionals and climate affected professionals. And you can go to adaptationprofessionals.org to check out some of their resources if you want to learn more. So the ways we have found success in working towards seeing climate impacts and adaptation actions in practice are related to these ideas. And here are some of the main takeaways. Build trust, bring unbiased science, don't overinflate or minimize the impacts of climate change, and really just tell it like it is. Show up, listen, be transparent, be humble, remind yourself of your audience's values and anchor your message from their perspective. Help make connections between climate change and real life issues, such as things that affect their bottom line, like jobs, health, family, and culture. Support engagement by promoting actions and tangible solutions. Reduce fear and support learning through examples. And climate-informed decisions are typically about people in place, not about climate. So focus on their place, their knowledge, and their decision. And in the last part of this lecture today, we will talk about telling your own adaptation story. So more people are thinking about climate change. So the more you're out there talking about it and talking about it confidently, you'll have access to a broader audience and facilitate a greater backing. So you probably started to think about how the heck you're going to fund all of this while doing step 5. And now's the time to think about how you will secure funding for these adaptation plans. And appeals for funding really start with effective communication and storytelling. Telling your adaptation story can give you an opportunity to highlight the co-benefits of good management, where managing for long-term benefits, ecosystem function, and or a range of future conditions. And this is all part of the climate change adaptation plan. So make your story about your land or project and getting that good management done. So I think we all have an appreciation for good storytellers. Some people may have that natural tendency, but we can all become good storytellers with practice and some pointers. So here are a few things to consider when telling your adaptation story. First, tailor the message to the audience. Think about the adaptation plan you describe might be communicated differently for a different audience. So if you immediately thought of a board of directors or your direct supervisor, what would it look like if or when you communicated to a wider community or a funding agency? How would the messaging differ there? Follow a logical sequence of ideas and connect the dots. Be clear about intentionality and include specific details at the level necessary to get your point across. Indicate that you have thought it through and back it up with sound logic and rationale. Don't overload the audience with all of the information in your plan. And lastly, connect your actions to the bigger picture here: climate change, vulnerabilities, ecosystem management, conservation, and adaptation. So again, here's an example storyline to follow. Start with your place and purpose, move on to key risks from climate change, then adaptation actions to address those risks, and end with outcomes and benefits of those actions. So all of this should sound pretty familiar because you've already done this. Your adaptation plan has set you up with these key strategies in mind. So you're totally equipped to tell your adaptation story today. And that's good because next week, that's what we'll be doing. We're going to ask you to create that pitch. And this is one of our favorite parts because you will all have the chance to share your story. It's understandable to feel maybe a little overwhelmed at this point, but don't worry, the presentations will be short, just 5 minutes. And this is just to ensure everyone gets a chance to go and ensure time for questions. So this is about a minute per slide, and someone will let you know in the chat box when you're about to reach your 5-minute mark. What we're trying to get you to do is really just simplify your plan into essentially an elevator pitch to tell your story. So not every detail will be included, but we really want to know why this place is important, what's at risk, and what you're going to do about it. And we want you to get creative. Maybe you have some visuals of your future, either like a Bob Ross style or even just maps. And 5 minutes is not a lot of time, so please just try to stick to about 1 minute and 15 seconds per slide and be sure to simplify. This is a really hard skill to develop, and if you're like me, you'll want to share every detail of your adaptation workbook, but for the purposes of time, focus on telling your story, be creative, and focus on the questions. What's your future vision and how will adaptation help get you there? And this is really a good opportunity to practice picking out the main points and telling your story to others. So your homework is to fill out these template slides for your short presentation. We will email these slides to you, and so you can fill them out and return them to Danielle by Thursday, May 20th, either directly via email or uploaded to the Google Drive in PowerPoint or PDF form, and the link for that will also be included in the follow-up email. This first slide will introduce your project, place, purpose, and audience. And key goals here are to describe what makes this project area special and to share the major management goals that relate to your story. And of course, you're welcome to customize these slides however you see fit. The next template slide outlines the top 2 to 4 climate impacts and management challenges that are most important for your story. So you will summarize your ideas from your adaptation workbook in step 2, climate impacts, and step 3, challenges and opportunities. The key question here is, how does climate change make it harder or easier for you to achieve your management goals or objectives? Then the next slide outlines your adaptation actions. This is where you really connect place and context to talk about what you're doing and what you're going to do. So why is this the best action for the challenges that you addressed in the slide before? This is also a really cool place to talk about maybe new and different approaches to what would maybe be a typical management strategy. So how are you tweaking things? Did you bring in something completely new, or maybe you're adding an addendum to the processes you're already doing? And then the next template slide outlines, oops, I went back. Okay, finally, you'll summarize your outcomes. So what are the key outcomes you hope to achieve through this project? This outcomes box really hits at why is this important and what is the big long-term outcome that you're trying to achieve. And again, please feel free to customize these slides, but just remember to keep it simple, tell a story, and make sure to practice your presentation so it's a maximum of 5 minutes. So you'll all have the chance to sign up for your presentation slot. We'll be using the lecture and discussion periods next week. So Monday from 2 to 3, Tuesday from 11 to noon, and Wednesday from 3 to 4 Eastern time. The link is listed here and will be sent out in the follow-up email as well. So be sure to fill that out as you're able and sign up for whatever slot works best for your schedule. So your assignment for this week is to summarize your project in PowerPoint to share with your course participants. Please send your presentation to Danielle via email or through the Google Drive link by Thursday, May 20th. The follow-up email will include the presentation template slides and details for submission. And then you'll also want to finish up and finalize your adaptation workbook, including homework 6 by next Monday, May 24th. And then there's also some optional reading here on climate change communication, including a paper on communicating climate change adaptation and resilience, and also a practical guide to values-based communication. We also have a bonus completely optional assignment for you all. We would love to turn your projects into one of our adaptation demonstrations. Adaptation demonstrations are real-world examples of how managers have integrated climate considerations into land management planning and efforts, and all of these projects use the resources we've shared with you to test new ideas and actions for responding to changing conditions. Examples of the adaptation demos can be found on the Forest Adaptation website, and we'll also share a template with you. So if you're interested in filling that out, providing a few photos, we can get that up on our website. You can also request one of us to write up the first draft, and that's something we're happy to do. Even if you're in the early stages of thinking, a demo page is a really great opportunity just to share your story and perspectives for others to learn more. So it's something we definitely encourage. All right, I know that was a longer lecture. So this is the last slide. Looking ahead, this week we have discussion sessions to recap steps 4 and 5. So be prepared to discuss your adaptation tactics and monitoring ideas on Tuesday or Wednesday. Then next week, you will have the opportunity to share your stories. Presentations will start on May 24th and will take place over the 3 sessions. And so just remember to sign up for a time that works best for you and attend all of the sessions if you're able, just to support your course participants and learn more about what adaptation projects others are working on. So that is it for today's lecture. Are there any questions for Leslie or I?